Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into something that has captivated minds for decades, a mystery wrapped in cuneiform and clay, a story that starts in the dust of ancient Mesopotamia and stretches all the way to modern conspiracy theories and best-selling books that have sold millions of copies worldwide. We're talking about the Anunnaki, those enigmatic beings from Sumerian texts, and the question that refuses to die. The question that has spawned documentaries and websites and heated debates. What really forced them to come to Earth? Or more accurately, as we'll discover tonight, did they come to Earth at all? And if not, why has this story become so powerful in modern imagination? Before we begin this journey through 5,000 years of history, interpretation, controversy, and yes, systematic mistranslation, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy deep dives into ancient mysteries, and subscribe to the channel if you appreciate thoughtful explorations of history's most intriguing questions. Click that notification bell so you don't miss future investigations into the fascinating intersection of archaeology, mythology, and modern interpretations that sometimes veer spectacularly far from historical truth. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your world. There's something genuinely fascinating about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, from Tokyo to Toronto, from London to Lima, from Sydney to Sao Paulo, sharing this moment of curiosity together, united by questions about our ancient past and the beings who may or may not have visited it. Now, settle in. Maybe dim the lights, get comfortable, pour yourself something warm to drink, adjust your headphones, and let's ease into this story the way it deserves to be told, with patience, meticulous detail, thorough examination of actual evidence, and a healthy dose of skepticism mixed with genuine wonder. Because tonight's journey will take us from the baked clay tablets of ancient Sumer, preserved for millennia beneath desert sands, to the best-selling books of the 1970s that sparked a cultural phenomenon. We'll travel from legitimate archaeological discoveries that revolutionized our understanding of human civilization to wildly speculative interpretations that captured imaginations while ignoring evidence. We'll examine what ancient texts actually say versus what some people desperately, almost religiously want them to say. And we'll ask ourselves why, in an age of unprecedented scientific knowledge, millions of people still prefer ancient astronaut theories to the genuinely remarkable story of human achievement. The tale of the Anunnaki has become one of those cultural phenomena that exists in multiple versions simultaneously, like a fractal of belief systems. There's the ancient version, preserved in clay tablets that were buried for millennia beneath the sands of Iraq, written in a wedge-shaped script called cuneiform by scribes whose names we sometimes know and sometimes don't. There's the modern popular version, born from the imagination and questionable scholarship of a self-taught researcher named Zecharia Sitchin, who saw in those ancient texts something that no trained scholar before or since has found, a detailed account of ancient alien visitors who genetically engineered humanity. And then there's the truth, which sits somewhere in the profoundly uncomfortable space between what we definitively know and what we desperately want to believe, between archaeological evidence and hopeful interpretation, between ancient mythology and modern myth-making. The story begins, as so many ancient mysteries do, with ruins. Not the romantic, Instagram-worthy, picturesque ruins that tourists photograph while eating gelato, but broken walls and shattered pottery scattered across a harsh landscape between two rivers. The kind of ruins that tell stories of civilizations that rose and fell millennia before the Greeks or Romans ever existed. Mesopotamia, the ancient Greeks called it, the land between rivers, a deceptively simple name for one of humanity's most complex and consequential civilizations. Today we know this region as Iraq, a country whose modern troubles obscure its ancient glory. But 5,000 years ago this was the cradle of something revolutionary, something that would change human existence forever. This was where civilization as we understand it first emerged, where humans first transformed from scattered agricultural communities into organized urban societies. The Sumerians emerged from the mists of prehistory around 4,500 BCE, though their origins remain mysterious and contested among us as scholars. They appeared in the southern region of Mesopotamia, settling in the fertile plain created by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in a landscape that was simultaneously harsh and promising. They weren't the first humans to live there by any means. Archaeological evidence shows human habitation stretching back tens of thousands of years. But they were the first to do something absolutely extraordinary, something that would echo through all subsequent human history. They built cities, actual cities, not villages, not seasonal settlements, not extended family compounds, but genuine urban centres with populations in the tens of thousands, with monumental architecture, with specialised labour, with bureaucracies and priesthoods and artisan quarters. Places like Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Nippur and Lagash rose from the desert, their names now exotic and ancient sounding, but once simply the homes of thousands of people who lived, worked, loved, fought and died in streets that archaeologists would excavate thousands of years later. In Uruk alone, at its height around 3000 BCE, perhaps 40,000 to 80,000 people lived within its massive walls, walls that stretched for 6 miles in circumference, walls that the Epic of Gilgamesh would later praise as one of that legendary king's greatest achievements. These weren't primitive people scratching out a bare existence, constantly on the edge of starvation and disaster. The Sumerians built multi-story buildings made of mud brick, with sophisticated drainage systems and courtyards designed to catch cooling breezes. They laid out streets in rational grids rather than the organic tangles that characterize spontaneous settlements. They developed specialized labor to a degree unprecedented in human history. In a Sumerian city, you might find potters, brewers, bakers, metalworkers, jewelers, scribes, priests, soldiers, merchants, administrators, and farmers, each focused on their particular craft or role, each dependent on the others for goods and services they didn't produce themselves. This specialization required complex systems of exchange and record keeping, which brings us to perhaps the Sumerians' greatest gift to human civilization. They invented writing, actual writing, not simple pictographs or tally marks, but a system capable of capturing the full complexity of human language. They looked at the chaos of human speech and thought, all its nuances and subtleties and ambiguities, and found a way to trap it in clay, to make words and ideas solid and permanent and transmissible across generations. Cuneiform, they called it, eventually, though that's a Latin word meaning wedge-shaped, named for the characteristic triangular impressions that scribes made by pressing sharpened reeds into soft clay tablets. The development of this writing system wasn't instantaneous. Scholars can trace its evolution over centuries, from simple pictographs representing concrete objects, a jar, a sheep, a star, to increasingly abstract symbols representing sounds and concepts, ideas that had no simple visual representation. The earliest texts we have, dating to around 3400 BCE, are administrative documents, records of grain distributions and livestock counts, the mundane bookkeeping of temple bureaucracies. But this mundane bookkeeping was revolutionary because suddenly human knowledge didn't have to die with each generation, didn't have to rely on imperfect memory and oral transmission. It could be preserved, copied, studied, critiqued, built upon, corrected, expanded. The implications were staggering. A scribe in Uruk could record a mathematical calculation, and another scribe in Ur, miles away and years later, could read it, verify it, use it as the basis for new calculations. Legal codes could be written down, ensuring that justice wasn't merely the whim of whoever held power, but was based on recorded precedent and established principle. Religious hymns and myths could be standardized, preserved, shared among different cities. Scientific observations, particularly of astronomical phenomena, could be recorded, allowing patterns to emerge over years and decades and centuries. Medical knowledge could be compiled and transmitted from teacher to student with greater accuracy than oral instruction alone could manage. The Sumerians invented the wheel, not initially as a children's toy or a philosophical symbol, but as an intensely practical tool of commerce, warfare, and agriculture. The earliest wheels we found date to around 3500 BCE, solid wooden discs mounted on axles, used on carts for transporting goods and on chariots for warfare. They developed irrigation systems so sophisticated that they turned what would naturally be desert into farmland capable of feeding those massive urban populations. They dug canals, built dikes, created reservoirs, managed water flow with a sophistication that wouldn't be matched in Europe for thousands of years. They created mathematics, including the sexagesimal or base 60 number system that we still use today when we divide hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds. When we measure circles in 360 degrees, why base 60? Scholars aren't entirely certain, but it has convenient mathematical properties, being divisible by many numbers: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, 60. This makes calculations easier and fractions simpler. The Sumerians developed astronomical mathematics of remarkable sophistication, tracking the movements of planets and stars, predicting eclipses, developing calendars that reconciled the solar year with the lunar month, a mathematical challenge that still influences how we calculate the date of Easter today. They brewed beer, lots and lots of beer, and considered it so important to civilization that they had a goddess, Ninkasi, specifically for brewing, and hymns to Ninkasi that doubled as beer recipes, preserving the knowledge of fermentation in religious poetry. They had schools called eduba or tablet houses, where young boys, almost exclusively from wealthy families because literacy was a luxury and an investment that poor families couldn't afford, learned to read and write by copying texts over and over until their cuneiform characters were perfect, until they could reproduce the exact shapes and pressures that define the script. We have thousands of these practice tablets, showing the progression from clumsy beginner attempts to polished professional work. Some students scratched frustrated comments in the margins, complaints about harsh teachers or difficult lessons that echo across millennia. "I hate school," one student wrote. "The teacher hit me." Some things about education apparently never change. These students also learned mathematics, literature, music, and Sumerian itself, which by the later periods when many of these tablets were written was already becoming a dead language, preserved for scholarship and religion the way Latin was preserved in medieval Europe. But what makes the Sumerians truly remarkable for our story tonight, what makes them central to the question of the Anunnaki, isn't just their technological and cultural achievements, impressive as those were. It's what they left behind in those hundreds of thousands of clay tablets. Shopping lists and legal contracts, yes. Those mundane documents that tell us about grain prices and property disputes. Mathematical exercises showing students learning to calculate areas and volumes. Astronomical observations recording the positions of Venus over decades. Medical texts describing symptoms and treatments, some surprisingly effective, some wildly wrong. Magical incantations meant to ward off demons or cure diseases. And crucially, for our purposes, embedded in their literature and mythology, detailed stories about their gods, about creation, about the relationship between divine and human, about the structure of the cosmos and humanity's place in it. The Sumerians were polytheists, a word that hardly captures the complexity and sophistication of their religious worldview. They worshipped a vast pantheon of deities who controlled different aspects of existence, from cosmic principles like heaven and earth to local phenomena like the specific fertility of a particular field. There was Anu, sometimes called An, god of the heavens, the vault of sky that arched over the world. Enlil, god of air and storms, the sometimes gentle, sometimes destructive winds that brought rain for crops or devastating tempests that destroyed them. Enki, sometimes called Ea in later Akkadian texts, god of water and wisdom, sweet underground water that made life possible in a desert environment, and the intelligence to use that water wisely. Inanna, later Ishtar, goddess of love and war, that powerful combination of creation and destruction, passion and violence that characterized both sexual relations and military conflict. Utu, the sun god, later called Shamash, who saw everything that happened on earth during his daily journey across the sky, making him the god of justice because nothing could be hidden from his gaze. Nanna, the moon god, later called Sin, whose waxing and waning marked the passage of months, whose silver light illuminated the night. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, associated with childbirth and nurturing. Nergal, god of death and the underworld. Each major city had its patron deity, whose temple formed the literal and metaphorical center of urban life, a massive ziggurat rising above the surrounding buildings, visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. These weren't abstract theological concepts or distant philosophical principles. The Sumerians genuinely believed their gods existed as conscious beings with personalities, desires, emotions, and, yes, needs. They believed that a god statue housed in the inner sanctum of their temple was not a mere representation but the actual dwelling place of that god, the physical location where the divine being lived and could be approached. Temple priests followed elaborate daily rituals of feeding these statues, clothing them, entertaining them with music, all based on the belief that gods, like humans, had physical and emotional needs that required attention. A deity's temple was their literal house, their residence, equipped with bedrooms and dining halls and reception areas. The gods had boats, full-size barges that were normally stored inside temple precincts and brought out during festivals, elaborately decorated vessels that carried the god statue through the city or between cities, allowing the deity to visit other gods or to process through streets lined with worshippers. They had chariots for overland transport, magnificent vehicles drawn by oxen or donkeys, again carrying the statue that housed the god's presence. Sometimes a deity's cult statue would be transported to a battlefield so the god could watch their city's warriors fight, providing divine oversight and hopefully divine protection. The relationship between humans and gods was understood as reciprocal, but not equal. Humans provided worship, sacrifices, and maintenance of temples, while gods provided cosmic order, protection from chaos, and the fundamental conditions that made civilized life possible. And then there were the Anunnaki. The word itself appears in Sumerian texts from about 2400 BCE onward, but not with the frequency or prominence you might expect, given how famous they've become in modern times, how central they are to ancient astronaut theories, how their name appears in countless books and documentaries and websites devoted to alternative history. In the earliest writings from Gudea of Lagash, around 2144, 2124 BCE, and texts from the Third Dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BCE, the Anunnaki are mentioned as a group of deities, important ones certainly, but one group among many in a crowded divine hierarchy. The name translates roughly as princely offspring, royal offspring, or those of princely blood, derived from Anu, the sky god, plus a Sumerian term meaning offspring or seed. In these ancient texts, carefully baked into clay and buried for millennia until archaeologists recovered them in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Anunnaki aren't aliens or astronauts or miners or genetic engineers or any of the things that modern popular theories claim. They're gods, divine beings who exist in exactly the same mythological framework as all the other Mesopotamian deities, subject to the same kind of portrayal, the same artistic conventions, the same theological principles. Sometimes in the text they're associated with the heavens, sometimes with the earth, sometimes explicitly as the descendants of Anu and his consort Ki, who was the personification of earth. In some texts they seem to be the 7 or 50 or 600 gods who decree fates, who make judgments, who maintain cosmic order alongside other divine beings. By the Middle Babylonian period, roughly 1600 to 1000 BCE, the term Anunnaki became increasingly associated with the underworld, with the realm of the dead, while a different group of gods, the Igigi, became associated with the heavens. This wasn't a demotion exactly. The underworld wasn't hell in the Christian sense, just a different part of the cosmos requiring divine administration. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the great creation epic written on 7 tablets and discovered at Nineveh in the ruins of the library of Ashurbanipal, the Anunnaki appear as 600 underworld deities working alongside 300 heavenly gods, all organized by Marduk after his victory over the primordial chaos monster Tiamat. In the standard Akkadian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we'll discuss more later, Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the Great Flood, describes the Anunnaki as 7 judges of the underworld who watch as the storm approaches, who set the land aflame with their presence, who later mourn the destruction of humanity. The critical point, the absolutely essential thing to understand before we go any further into modern theories and ancient texts, is that in actual Sumerian and Akkadian literature, the Anunnaki are never, not once, not in any text that has been found and translated by qualified scholars, portrayed as extraterrestrials, as space travelers, as beings from another planet, as ancient astronauts, or as anything other than gods within the normal theological framework of Mesopotamian religion. They don't arrive from space. They don't come from a mysterious planet called Nibiru. They don't mine gold or conduct genetic experiments or build landing platforms. They decree fates, judge the dead, participate in divine assemblies, maintain cosmic order, and do all the other things that gods do in Mesopotamian mythology. The archaeological rediscovery of these texts began in the mid-19th century, during that period of European and American imperial expansion, when Western powers were carving up the Middle East and North Africa, when archaeologists, sometimes more like treasure hunters or looters than modern scientific excavators, started digging in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities. In 1849, the British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard, working at Nineveh in what is now northern Iraq, made one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries of all time. He found the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Assyrian Empire who ruled from 668 to 627 BCE. Ashurbanipal was undoubtedly a brutal despot by any reasonable moral standard. His annals boast of cities destroyed and enemies tortured, but he was also, crucially for us, a tireless archivist and obsessive collector of texts. Ashurbanipal sent scribes throughout his empire and beyond to copy ancient texts, to acquire tablets, to preserve knowledge from earlier periods. His library eventually contained over 30,000 clay tablets, including copies of much older Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian texts, some going back nearly 2,000 years before his own time. This library, preserved by the same destructive fire that destroyed the palace containing it, the heat baking the tablets even harder than they already were, making them more durable than the original scribes could have imagined, gave modern scholars access to the largest single collection of Mesopotamian literature ever found. The Epic of Gilgamesh was here, the story of a legendary king's quest for immortality. The Enuma Elish was here, Babylon's creation myth explaining how Marduk created the world. Countless other myths, hymns, prayers, medical texts, astronomical observations, and administrative documents. Deciphering these texts took decades of painstaking, often frustrating work. Scholars like Henry Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, and Jules Oppert had to crack the cuneiform script, learn dead languages that no one had spoken for over 2,000 years, piece together fragmentary tablets like three-dimensional puzzles where most of the pieces are missing, and gradually develop dictionaries and grammars for languages that had vanished from human use before the Roman Empire existed. The process was slow, careful, scientific, built on comparison of texts, identification of patterns, testing of hypotheses. Sometimes scholars got things wrong initially and had to revise their understanding as more texts were found and better methods developed. But gradually, methodically, they cracked the code. What emerged was a window into a world that had been lost for millennia, a civilization as sophisticated and complex as any in the ancient world, possibly more sophisticated than anything that existed elsewhere at the same time. The deciphering of Sumerian and Akkadian texts revolutionized our understanding of ancient history, biblical studies, and the development of human civilization. For the first time, scholars could read what the Mesopotamians themselves wrote about their world, not filtered through Greek or Hebrew or later sources, but in their own words, in their own languages, expressing their own thoughts and beliefs in the ways they chose to express them. The picture that emerged was rich, complex, often surprising, revealing a culture that was simultaneously alien in its assumptions and familiar in its concerns, that grappled with the same existential questions we still face while approaching those questions from a radically different cultural perspective. The creation myths they found were fascinating, complex, multi-layered texts that worked on multiple levels simultaneously as theology, as literature, as political propaganda, as attempts to explain natural phenomena. The Enuma Elish tells a story of cosmic conflict, of primordial deities battling for supremacy, of younger gods rising up against older powers, of the god Marduk defeating the chaos monster Tiamat and creating an ordered world from her corpse. It's a violent, dramatic story, full of political allegory about Babylon's rise to power in the 2nd millennium BCE and theological arguments about which god deserved to be chief of the pantheon, which city deserved to rule Mesopotamia. The text begins with the famous words, "when on high," describing a time before creation when nothing existed except primordial waters, fresh water personified as Apsu and salt water personified as Tiamat. From their mingling the first gods are born, and these gods immediately become problematic, loud and disruptive and disturbing the peace. Apsu wants to destroy them, but Ea, god of wisdom, kills Apsu first. Tiamat, enraged by her consort's death, creates monsters and prepares for war against the younger gods. The gods are terrified, none of them willing to face this primordial being, until young Marduk agrees to fight on one condition: if he wins, he must be made king of the gods. The deal is struck. Marduk defeats Tiamat using winds and storms, splits her body in half like a shellfish, and from her corpse creates heaven and earth. In this epic, written on 7 clay tablets and performed publicly during Babylonian New Year festivals, the Anunnaki appear as part of the divine bureaucracy that Marduk establishes after his victory. After defeating Tiamat and organizing the cosmos, after fixing the positions of the stars and establishing the calendar, after all these cosmic administrative tasks, Marduk assigns the Anunnaki their positions. He places 300 in the heavens to watch the sky, and 300 on earth to maintain order in the lower world. They're supporting characters in this drama, important certainly, part of the infrastructure of the organized cosmos, but not the protagonists, not the central focus. The story is about Marduk's rise to power, about how Babylon's patron god earned his right to rule all other gods. Another crucial text, vitally important for understanding later misinterpretations, is the Atrahasis epic, an Akkadian flood story dating to around 1800 BCE, but based on older Sumerian sources going back perhaps to 2300 BCE or earlier. Scholars know the main version of this text from tablets copied by a scribe named Ku'aya, whose name appears in the colophon, the scribe's signature at the end of the text. We can actually trace his handwriting across multiple tablets, recognizing his individual style and quirks. This epic contains elements that would later be radically, almost unrecognizably reinterpreted by modern ancient astronaut theorists, twisted into something the original authors would never recognize. In the Atrahasis, we find a creation story with a very different flavor than the Enuma Elish's cosmic battle narrative. This story is more focused on labor, work, toil, and the creation of humanity to relieve divine beings from exhausting manual labor. It begins with a division of labor among the gods after the organization of the cosmos, after the fundamental structure of reality has been established. The great gods, the Anunnaki, are the administrators, the ruling council who made decisions and assigned tasks. Below them are the Igigi, lesser deities who are assigned all the hard physical labor of maintaining the world, digging canals to irrigate fields, dredging rivers to keep them flowing properly, farming land to produce food, all the back-breaking work required to keep an agricultural civilization functioning. According to the text, this arrangement works for a while. The cosmos functions smoothly, the divine hierarchy is stable, but eventually, after 40 years of endless toil, the Igigi gods grow resentful. 40 years of digging canals, of hauling earth, of cultivating fields, of maintaining irrigation systems, with no end in sight and no relief. They're exhausted, exploited, pushed beyond what they can endure. Their work is endless, the toil is heavy, the misery too much to bear, so they rebel. In a vivid scene, they burn their tools, the shovels and baskets they've been using for 4 decades, and surround the house of Enlil, the god in charge of Earth, refusing to work anymore, demanding change. Enlil, confronted with this divine labor strike, is furious. He wants to punish the rebels severely, crush the uprising with overwhelming force, reassert divine hierarchy through violence. But Anu, the sky god and father of both Enlil and Enki, counsels wisdom instead of wrath. Enki, the clever god of wisdom and water, who often plays the role of problem solver in Mesopotamian myths, proposes an alternative, an innovative solution to what seems like an intractable crisis. Why not create a new class of being to do this work instead? Why not fashion creatures specifically designed for agricultural labour, beings who can maintain civilization, but who lack the divine status and power that would make them dangerous if they rebelled? In short, create humans. In the text, the goddess Nintu, sometimes called Mummy, the mother goddess associated with childbirth and creation, with Enki's help, fashions the first humans from clay mixed with the blood and flesh of a slain god, specifically one of the Igigi who had been a ringleader in the rebellion, a god named We'ila or Geshtu-ii, depending on the version. This mixing of clay with divine substance is crucial in Mesopotamian understanding. It explains why humans are mortal, made of clay that returns to dust, but also possess intelligence and spirit, the divine blood that gives them consciousness and capability beyond mere animals. These first humans are created explicitly. The text is clear about this, to serve the gods, to do the agricultural labour that the divine beings no longer want to do themselves, to be workers who sustain the cosmic order through their toil. This is authentic Sumerian and Akkadian mythology, written in cuneiform on clay tablets that we can examine in museums today, texts that have been carefully studied by hundreds of scholars over more than a century, translated and retranslated compared with other texts, analysed linguistically and historically and theologically. It's a creation story that reflects the world view of an agricultural civilization, where farming was the primary human activity, where the vast majority of people spent their lives engaged in backbreaking labour in fields, where urban civilization was only possible because of the agricultural surplus created by countless farmers working land that required constant maintenance. The idea that humans were created to work, to serve a purpose in maintaining cosmic order through labour, wasn't insulting or demeaning to the Sumerians. It was simply how things were, a theological explanation for an economic and social reality. The Atrahasis continues with humanity multiplying and spreading across the earth, succeeding perhaps too well at their assigned task of maintaining civilization. The human population grows, cities expand, agriculture flourishes. But then there's a problem, one that will drive the rest of the narrative toward its famous flood climax. Humans become too numerous, too productive of civilization, too loud, too disruptive to divine peace. The noise of human civilization, the constant din of thousands or tens of thousands of people living in cities disturbs the sleep of Enlil. Now, we might read noise metaphorically as disorder or chaos or simply excessive human presence, but the text seems quite literal about this. Enlil can't sleep because humans are too loud. Enlil's response, increasingly desperate as his divine insomnia continues, is to send various disasters to reduce the human population. First, he sends a plague, a disease that sweeps through human populations, killing many. But Enki, who had helped create humanity and who feels a certain responsibility toward his creatures, intervenes. He teaches humans to appeal not to their personal deities but to the specific god responsible for plague, Namtar, essentially petitioning the personified disease itself for mercy. The strategy works. The plague subsides, human population recovers, the noise resumes. Then Enlil tries drought and famine, cutting off rain, letting crops fail, watching humans starve. Again Enki helps, this time releasing fish from rivers and lakes in such quantities that humans have food despite the drought. Population recovers, noise continues. Finally, after several failed attempts to reduce humanity to manageable numbers through intermediate disasters, Enlil decides on a more permanent, more comprehensive solution. He proposes a great flood that will wipe out humanity entirely, a complete reset of the human experiment that will restore divine peace and quiet. The other gods, exhausted by the noise and perhaps swayed by Enlil's arguments, agree to this plan. They swear a solemn oath not to warn the humans about what's coming, to let the flood destroy them without warning, to end the human experiment that has become more trouble than it's worth. But Enki, characteristically clever and sympathetic to humanity, finds a loophole in his oath. He doesn't speak directly to the human Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, and who seems to be Enki's particular devotee and favourite. Instead, Enki speaks to a wall, addressing it loudly enough for anyone who might happen to be on the other side, say Atrahasis in his house, to overhear. "Wall," he says, "I'm going to tell you something. There's a catastrophic flood coming. The gods have decided to destroy humanity. If someone were wise, they might build a boat, a very large boat, and load it with animals and family and supplies, and seal it with pitch to make it waterworthy, and wait for a flood that will cover the earth." It's a technical compliance with his oath. He hasn't spoken to a human while violating its obvious intent. Atrahasis, exceedingly wise indeed, takes Enki's hint. He builds the boat following Enki's detailed specifications, which the text provides in remarkable detail, measurements and construction techniques and materials. He loads it with animals, 2 of each kind according to some versions, along with his family and craftsmen and supplies. He seals it with bitumen and waits. The flood comes. The text describes it in vivid, terrifying detail. The storm god Adad makes the sky dark, rain falls in sheets, the ocean rises, the earth is covered. The destruction is total. Humans who didn't board the ark die by the thousands. The text says the Anunnaki, observing this catastrophe, light the land with their radiance and then mourn, genuinely grieve the destruction of humanity. The flood lasts 7 days and 7 nights of continuous deluge, then gradually recedes. Atrahasis sends out birds to check for dry land, a dove first, then a swallow, finally a raven that doesn't return, indicating it found somewhere to land. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. Atrahasis disembarks and immediately makes a sacrifice to the gods. The text describes the gods' reaction in memorable, almost comic terms. They were starving. Without humans to provide sacrifices and offerings, the gods had no food. When Atrahasis makes his sacrifice, the gods swarm around it like flies, desperately hungry after 7 days without worship or offerings. Enlil is initially furious that humanity survived, that his plan for complete extermination failed. But the other gods, now fully aware of how much they depend on human worship for their own sustenance and comfort, protect Atrahasis. A deal is struck. Humanity is allowed to continue existing, but with limitations designed to prevent the overpopulation problem that triggered the flood. The goddess Nintu establishes death as a permanent feature of human existence, rather than something that can be avoided. She introduces infant mortality, tragic but effective at reducing population growth. She creates categories of women who will be unable to have children through biology or social role, further limiting reproduction. Humanity continues, but constrained, unable to grow so numerous that the noise becomes unbearable again. This is the real Atrahasis epic, what the text actually says when you read it as mythology rather than mistranslated history. This is the Babylonian flood story that predates the biblical Noah narrative by centuries and clearly influenced it, though with significant theological differences reflecting the different religious worldviews of polytheistic Mesopotamia and monotheistic Israel. And if you're familiar with the modern theories about the Anunnaki, if you've encountered Zecharia Sitchin's work or watched Ancient Aliens or read any of the countless books and websites devoted to ancient astronaut theories, you're probably already seeing where later interpreters found the raw material for their very different story. For nearly a century after the initial discovery and translation of these texts, scholars treated them as what they appeared to be: mythology, meaning not lies or falsehoods, but stories that expressed religious beliefs, cosmological understandings, and cultural values through narrative. Bronze Age creation stories and flood narratives, similar in many ways to biblical accounts that followed them, reflecting the religious beliefs and worldview of ancient Mesopotamian civilization, helping us understand how these ancient people made sense of their world. Academic conferences discussed them. Scholarly articles analysed their literary structures and theological implications. Translations were refined as more texts were found and linguistic understanding improved. They were remarkable and important, shedding light on the origins of Western religion and literature, but they were understood as mythology. But in 1976, everything changed. The entire discourse around these texts, particularly around the Anunnaki, was permanently altered by the publication of a single book by a man who had become either a revolutionary truth-teller or a pseudo-scientific charlatan, depending on your perspective and your relationship with actual evidence. A man named Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet, the first in what would eventually become a 7-book series known as the Earth Chronicles, along with several companion volumes and spin-offs. Sitchin wasn't a trained archaeologist. He held no degree in ancient Near Eastern studies. He wasn't a professional linguist specializing in Sumerian or Akkadian. He had a degree in economics from the University of London and had worked as a journalist and executive for a shipping company. But he claimed to have taught himself to read Sumerian cuneiform, to understand these ancient texts in ways that all the professional scholars somehow missed. According to Sitchin's interpretation, which he presented with absolute confidence and elaborate detail, the Sumerian texts weren't mythology at all. They were history, but not ordinary history, scientific history, precise accounts of actual events written by people who witnessed them or learned about them from those who did. Everything that scholars had been reading as metaphor, as religious symbolism, as mythological narrative, Sitchin read as literal truth, but with one crucial reinterpretation. The Anunnaki weren't gods in the religious sense, weren't supernatural beings, weren't personifications of natural forces or theological concepts. They were extraterrestrials, advanced beings from another planet, space travelers who had come to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago with advanced technology that ancient humans, lacking any frame of reference for such things, could only understand and describe as godlike power. Sitchin claimed he knew exactly why they came. What brought these advanced beings across interstellar space to Earth specifically? They came for gold. This is the foundation of his entire theoretical edifice, the reason that explains everything else, the motivation that drove all subsequent events in his reconstruction of ancient history. According to Sitchin's narrative, approximately 450,000 years ago, beings from a planet called Nibiru entered our solar system on one of their periodic passes through the inner planets. Nibiru, according to Sitchin, was a massive planet, possibly even a brown dwarf star in some versions, with a highly elliptical orbit that brought it through the inner solar system once every 3,600 years, spending most of its time far beyond Pluto in the outer darkness of the solar system. The inhabitants of this planet, the Anunnaki, discovered that their planet's atmosphere was deteriorating, breaking down, becoming unstable in ways that threatened all life on their world. The solution to this atmospheric crisis, Sitchin asserted, involved gold. They needed gold, vast quantities of it, to somehow repair or protect their atmosphere. Exactly how gold would fix an atmospheric problem, why you would need it in such quantities, what specific mechanism would make this work. These technical details were never clearly explained in Sitchin's books, but he asserted it with great confidence, citing what he claimed were references in Sumerian texts. The Anunnaki came to Earth because our planet was rich in gold deposits, conveniently accessible, at least by advanced alien standards. The Anunnaki established their first settlement, according to Sitchin's reading of ancient place names and descriptions, in Mesopotamia, specifically in the region that would later become Sumer. They called this first base Eridu, and archaeological evidence shows that Eridu was indeed one of the oldest Sumerian cities, possibly the oldest, dating to around 5,400 BCE. For Sitchin, this wasn't coincidence. Eridu was the Anunnaki's original base of operations, their first permanent settlement on Earth, the place where they began organizing their mining operations and their civilization on this foreign planet. From Eridu, they expanded, establishing other cities, each with its specific function in the overall operation. For thousands of years, by Sitchin's chronology, the Anunnaki mined gold themselves, establishing major operations in southeastern Africa, where some of the world's richest gold deposits are located, areas where modern mining still extracts gold today. They worked the mines, extracted the ore, processed it, transported it back to Mesopotamia, and presumably sent it onto Nibiru during the planet's periodic passages through our solar system. But the work was hard, brutally hard, exhausting, endless, dangerous, the kind of labour that grinds down even the strongest bodies and spirits. Mining is difficult enough with modern equipment and safety regulations. Imagine doing it for thousands of years, even if your species lives much longer than humans do. Eventually, around 300,000 years ago by Sitchin's timeline, the Anunnaki workers rebelled. This is where Sitchin's interpretation of the Atrahasis comes in, where he takes a mythological text about divine labour and reinterprets it as historical documentation of an alien labour dispute. The rebellion of the Igigi gods against the Anunnaki leadership, in Sitchin's view, wasn't mythological but historical. It wasn't about cosmic hierarchies but about working conditions. These were Anunnaki workers, alien miners, refusing to continue their grueling labour in the gold mines of Africa. They were tired, resentful, pushed to breaking point. They surrounded the dwelling of their leader and refused to work. This was a strike, a labour action, the kind of thing that happens when workers are exploited beyond endurance. And the solution that the Anunnaki leadership devised was the creation of humans. According to Sitchin, the creation of humanity described in the Atrahasis and other Mesopotamian texts was not a magical act of divine will, not gods forming clay into living beings through supernatural power, but a scientific process of genetic engineering conducted in laboratories by technologically advanced extraterrestrials. The Anunnaki, Sitchin claimed, took primitive hominids that already existed on Earth, probably Homo erectus according to the evolutionary timeline, and crossed their DNA with their own advanced alien genetics. The process involved in vitro fertilization, the mixing of genetic material in controlled laboratory conditions, creating hybrid beings that combined Anunnaki intelligence and capabilities with the physical adaptations that Homo erectus had developed for life on Earth. The result was Homo sapiens, modern humans, us. In Sitchin's telling, we are literally the children of ancient astronauts, genetically engineered hybrids created for a specific purpose. And that purpose was labour, specifically mining labour. We were created to be slaves, workers in alien mines, a solution to an extraterrestrial labour shortage. Our entire species, everything we are and have become, began as nothing more than the Anunnaki's answer to their personnel problems. They needed workers who were intelligent enough to understand and follow instructions, capable enough to do complex physical labour, but controllable enough that they wouldn't rebel like the Anunnaki workers had. So they created us. Sitchin claimed that all of human civilization, all of our early technological and agricultural development, all the achievements that archaeologists and historians attribute to human innovation, was actually the result of the Anunnaki's intervention and instruction. They taught us farming because they needed us to produce food efficiently. They gave us writing because they needed to keep records of production and administration. They showed us how to build cities because organized urban centers made managing large worker populations easier. The massive megalithic structures that ancient humans built, the pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the stone temples of Malta and Göbekli Tepe, these were either built by the Anunnaki themselves using their advanced technology, or constructed under their direct supervision by human workers following their designs and using techniques they taught us. The biblical accounts in Genesis, Sitchin argued with great confidence, were corrupted, simplified versions of these older Sumerian stories, written down centuries after the original events by people who no longer fully understood what they were recording. The Garden of Eden wasn't a theological metaphor for innocence lost. It was a literal place, an actual location, specifically a genetic laboratory or breeding compound, where the Anunnaki created and refined the first modern humans. The serpent who tempted Eve wasn't Satan in disguise, or a symbol of temptation. It was actually Enki, the Anunnaki scientist who had led the genetic engineering project and who felt sympathy for his creations, wanting them to gain knowledge even if his fellow Anunnaki wanted to keep humans ignorant and subservient. The Nephilim mentioned in Genesis chapter 6, those mysterious sons of God who took human women as wives and produced offspring, The mighty men of old, men of renown, these weren't angels or demigods in Sitchin's interpretation. They were hybrid beings, the children born when Anunnaki males, living among humans and working alongside them, took human women as sexual partners. These hybrid offspring had the advantages of both lineages, the enhanced capabilities of their Anunnaki fathers combined with the adaptability of their human mothers, making them remarkable, powerful, mighty individuals who became legendary in human memory as heroes and demigods. In Sitchin's framework, almost all ancient myths about gods consorting with mortals and producing remarkable offspring reflected this reality of Anunnaki human interbreeding. Sitchin identified specific Anunnaki leaders in his reconstruction of this ancient history, giving them roles and personalities and relationships based on his interpretation of Sumerian divine epithets and mythological narratives. Anu, the Sumerian sky god, was the ruler of Nibiru, the king who stayed on the home planet and supervised all operations from afar, the distant authority to whom everyone ultimately answered. His sons, Enlil and Enki, those two brothers whose conflicts appear throughout Mesopotamian mythology, came to Earth as the primary leaders of the Anunnaki operation here, dividing authority between them in ways that would create ongoing tension and conflict throughout human prehistory. Enlil, in Sitchin's telling, was the military commander, the strict authoritarian, the one in charge of mining operations and human control, always focused on efficiency and productivity and maintaining order. He saw humans as tools, useful but potentially dangerous, needing constant supervision and strict control. He was willing to use harsh measures to maintain discipline, quick to punish any perceived threat to Anunnaki authority. Enki, by contrast, was the scientist, the genetic engineer, the creative intellect who had designed humanity in the first place. He often sympathized with human suffering, felt a paternal connection to his creations, and frequently intervened to help humans even when it put him at odds with Enlil and the other Anunnaki leadership. In Sitchin's narrative, these beings weren't worshipped because they were gods in any mystical or supernatural sense. They were worshipped because they had advanced technology that seemed like magic to primitive humans who had no frame of reference for understanding it. Their spacecraft, capable of traveling between Earth and Nibiru, capable of orbital flight and atmospheric entry, looked like heavenly chariots, bright objects moving through the sky in ways that defied normal experience. Their powerful weapons, energy-based perhaps, or using principles of physics that humans wouldn't understand for millennia, seemed like divine thunder and lightning. Their long lifespans, a natural result of coming from a planet with a much longer orbital period where time might be experienced differently, or simply superior genetics and medical technology, made them seem immortal to humans who lived perhaps 30 or 40 years on average. The Great Flood described in the Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Sumerian Eridu Genesis, and later in the biblical book of Genesis, wasn't divine punishment for human wickedness in Sitchin's reinterpretation. It wasn't about sin or moral failure or divine justice. It was a natural catastrophe that the Anunnaki knew was coming, probably related to Nibiru's periodic passage through the inner solar system. The gravitational effects of this massive body passing relatively close to Earth, Sitchin suggested, might trigger tectonic disturbances, volcanic activity, and most relevantly the sudden melting or collapse of polar ice sheets, releasing vast quantities of water and causing catastrophic flooding. Enlil, learning about this coming disaster, decided to let humanity die in the flood. In Sitchin's version, this wasn't cruelty exactly, but a kind of cold calculation. Humanity had been an experiment that had gotten out of control. Humans were too numerous, too independent, too disruptive. The flood was an opportunity to reset everything, to let natural disaster solve what had become a management problem. Enlil argued that the Anunnaki should withdraw to orbital positions, wait out the flood from safety, and then return to Earth after it subsided to rebuild their operations without the human complications. But Enki, characteristically sympathetic, couldn't accept the genocide of his creations. He warned Atrahasis, told him to build an ark and ensured that humanity survived despite Enlil's plan. After the flood waters receded and the Anunnaki returned to Earth's surface, they discovered that humans had survived. Enlil was furious, but the other Anunnaki, according to Sitchin, recognized a reality that Enlil in his anger was blind to. They needed humans. Without human labor, without human worship and offerings, which in Sitchin's materialist interpretation meant without human agricultural production and service, the Anunnaki couldn't maintain their operations on Earth. They needed workers. They needed the civilization that humanity had begun to build. So humanity was allowed to continue, to rebuild after the flood, but with the controls and limitations described in the Atrahasis, measures designed to keep the population manageable. After the flood, the Anunnaki helped humanity rebuild, but they had learned their lesson about the dangers of too large a human population. They instituted the measures reflected in the Mesopotamian texts, practices, and biological facts that would limit reproduction. Then, sometime around 2000 BCE, according to Sitchin's chronology, the Anunnaki left Earth, or at least withdrew from direct contact with humanity, returning to their home planet Nibiru as it swung back out to the far reaches of the solar system. They left behind the civilization they had created, the humans they had genetically engineered, the legacy of their presence in myths and monuments. They left us to govern ourselves, to develop our own civilizations, to work out our own destiny without direct intervention. Though Sitchin hinted they might return someday when Nibiru's orbit brings it back through the inner solar system, Sitchin spent the rest of his life, from the 1976 publication of The 12th Planet until his death in October 2010, expanding on this theory through multiple books, each exploring different aspects of his ancient astronaut narrative. The Stairway to Heaven, in 1980, investigated ancient quests for immortality, interpreting them as humans trying to regain the longevity that their Anunnaki creators possessed. The Wars of Gods and Men, in 1985, reinterpreted ancient warfare as conflicts between different factions of Anunnaki who had divided Earth into territories and competed for resources and human allegiance. Later books explored connections between Anunnaki influence and every major ancient civilization, from Egypt to the Americas. Sitchin claimed to find evidence for his theory everywhere he looked. In Sumerian astronomical texts that he argued showed knowledge of all the planets in our solar system plus Nibiru, knowledge that ancient humans couldn't possibly have possessed without Anunnaki instruction. In cylinder seals, particularly the famous VA 243 seal that he claimed showed a diagram of the solar system, including the mysterious 12th planet, in ancient artwork where he saw depictions of astronauts, spacecraft, advanced technology. In archaeological anomalies, sites or artifacts that seemed too sophisticated for their time period, too advanced for the people who supposedly created them. Every mystery, every unexplained achievement, every remarkable ancient structure became evidence for his theory. The theory was explosive in its implications and its appeal. It offered simple, clear answers to some of the most persistent questions about human origins and ancient history, questions that mainstream archaeology and history often answer with complicated, uncertain explanations that lack the satisfying definitiveness that many people crave. How did civilization develop so quickly in Mesopotamia, going from agricultural villages to sophisticated cities in just a few centuries? Alien intervention, direct instruction from advanced beings who already knew how to build cities. How did ancient people build massive stone structures like the pyramids or Stonehenge, using supposedly primitive technology, alien technology, or alien supervision of human workers, or structures built by the Anunnaki themselves? Why do so many ancient cultures separated by vast distances have similar flood myths, similar creation stories, similar descriptions of gods descending from the heavens? Because they all experienced the same real catastrophe, the flood triggered by Nibiru's passage, and they all had contact with the same real beings, the Anunnaki who visited different regions and were remembered in local mythologies with different names but similar characteristics. Why do humans seem so different from other animals on Earth? So much more intelligent, so capable of abstract thought and cultural development? Because we're not entirely of Earth, we're hybrids, part terrestrial hominid and part extraterrestrial Anunnaki. a unique fusion that explains our unique capabilities. Sitchin's books sold millions of copies. They were translated into more than 25 languages, reaching audiences across the globe. They spawned an entire industry of ancient astronaut theory, influencing television shows like Ancient Aliens, which has run for over 20 seasons and reached hundreds of millions of viewers worldwide, inspiring countless books by other authors, elaborating on or modifying his basic framework, and creating a subculture of believers convinced that mainstream archaeology and history were hiding the truth about humanity's extraterrestrial origins, whether through ignorance or deliberate suppression. The theory was compelling because it seemed to explain so much so simply. It gave technological and scientific explanations for ancient myths, replacing supernatural intervention with advanced technology, making ancient religion comprehensible to modern materialist sensibilities. It suggested that humanity wasn't alone in the universe, that we were part of a larger cosmic community, that beings more advanced than ourselves had taken an interest in our development. It implied that we were created with purpose, even if that purpose was initially just to be workers, that our existence wasn't random or accidental but designed and intentional. It offered the tantalizing possibility that the Anunnaki might return, that Nibiru's orbit might bring them back to Earth in our lifetime, offering a kind of secular apocalypse or salvation depending on your perspective. But there was a problem with Sitchin's theory. Actually, there were many, many problems. Fundamental problems, devastating problems. Problems that should have made his theory collapse under scrutiny, because as popular as Sitchin's theory became, as much as it captured the imagination of millions of people worldwide, as influential as it has been in shaping popular understanding of ancient history and mythology, has one fatal flaw. It isn't true. Not in any sense that would satisfy actual scholarship, actual linguistics, actual archaeology, actual astronomy, or any rigorous examination of the claims against the evidence. The Sumerian texts don't say what Sitchin claimed they said, not even close. And the scholars who actually read ancient Mesopotamian languages, who have dedicated their entire careers to understanding these texts in their proper historical and cultural context, who have linguistic training and archaeological expertise and access to thousands of tablets that Sitchin never examined, they've been trying to explain this for decades. Let's start with the most basic, foundational claim of Sitchin's entire theoretical edifice, the reason that supposedly explains everything else, the motivation that drives his whole narrative, the claim that the Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold. This is essential to his theory. If this isn't true, if this isn't in the texts, if this is something Sitchin simply invented or misread or deliberately fabricated, then the entire edifice collapses. Everything else depends on this. So what do the actual Sumerian texts say about the Anunnaki and gold mining? Dr. Michael Heiser, who earned his PhD in Hebrew Bible and ancient Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, one of the premier programs in the world for ancient Near Eastern studies, conducted an exhaustive, comprehensive search of the entire corpus of Sumerian literature, looking for any reference, any mention, any hint that gods were mining gold or that gold mining was associated with the Anunnaki in any way whatsoever. He didn't just look at a few famous texts. He searched systematically through thousands of Sumerian documents, using the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature maintained by the University of Oxford, which contains essentially every known Sumerian text that has been translated, a vast database representing over a century of archaeological discovery and scholarly work. He found nothing, absolutely nothing, 0 references, not a single text, not one line, not even a fragmentary mention of gods mining gold or needing gold for technological purposes or coming to Earth to acquire gold. Gold appears in Sumerian texts, certainly, abundantly, is valuable, highly prized, used for jewelry and decoration and religious offerings, is a status symbol, a marker of wealth and power. Kings boast about acquiring gold. Temples are adorned with gold. Gods receive gold as tribute from worshippers. But nowhere, in any text, do the gods mine it themselves. Nowhere do they need it for anything beyond the ornamental and symbolic purposes that made gold valuable to humans. Nowhere is gold mining connected to the Anunnaki specifically, or to any divine purpose that would require vast quantities of the metal. Sitchin claimed that one of Enki's titles was Bel Nimiki, which he translated as Lord of Mining, using this as evidence that Enki was the Anunnaki leader in charge of mining operations, that his role in Mesopotamian mythology directly reflected his historical function as mining administrator. This translation, which appears prominently in the 12th planet and which has been repeated in countless ancient astronaut books and websites, appears nowhere in actual Sumerian scholarship, is not in any cuneiform dictionary, is not in any academic translation of Enki's titles and epithets. And Enki had many titles, many names, many roles in Mesopotamian religion. He was called Ea in Akkadian. He was the lord of the Absu, the sweet underground waters. He was the god of wisdom and magic. He was the craftsman of the gods. But lord of mining? That's Sitchin's invention, a translation with no basis in actual linguistics. The fundamental purpose of the Anunnaki in actual Sumerian texts, when you read them in their proper linguistic and cultural context rather than forcing modern theories onto ancient words, is not mining but governance and judgment. They're divine administrators, cosmic bureaucrats, if you will, judges who determine fates, enforcers of cosmic order, beings who maintain the structure and function of the universe. In the Enuma Elish, after Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the ordered cosmos from primordial chaos, he assigns the Anunnaki their positions, 300 in the heavens to watch the movements of stars and maintain celestial order, 300 on Earth to ensure terrestrial stability. They're not miners, they're administrators, maintaining the systems that Marduk established. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Anunnaki appear as judges of the underworld, the 7 or sometimes more deities who sit in judgment over the dead, who determine the fate of souls, who maintain order in the realm of death just as other gods maintain order in the realms of the living. In various Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are described as decreeing fates, making judgments, determining destinies. This is their function. This is what they do in Mesopotamian cosmology. They're part of the divine hierarchy that maintains order against chaos, structure against dissolution. Not a single text describes them as miners, as workers extracting resources, as labourers in the earth. The Atrahasis, which Sitchin claims describes the Anunnaki's labour problems in their mining operations, doesn't actually say that at all when you read it carefully in its original languages. The rebellion in that text is by the Igigi gods, not the Anunnaki. The Igigi are explicitly identified as the workers, the labourers, the ones doing the hard physical tasks. The Anunnaki are the ones in charge, the administrators, the ruling council that hears the Igiji's complaints. The text is clear about this distinction. The worker gods who rebel are one group. The ruling gods who decide how to handle the rebellion are a different group. Sitchin simply ignores this distinction, treating Anunnaki and Igigi as interchangeable when the texts carefully distinguish between them. Furthermore, the labour that the Igigi are complaining about in the Atrahasis isn't mining, it's agricultural work. The text specifically describes them digging canals for irrigation, dredging rivers to keep them navigable and useful for watering fields, farming land to produce food. This is the work of maintaining Mesopotamian civilization, which was fundamentally agricultural, dependent on sophisticated irrigation to turn desert into cropland. The Igigi have been doing this work for 40 years, and they're exhausted from it. They burn their tools, specifically their farming and irrigation tools, and rebel. The solution is to create humans to do this agricultural labour instead. Nothing about mining, nothing about gold. Everything about farming, irrigation, food production, the actual economic basis of Sumerian civilization. What about Nibiru, that mysterious planet that supposedly brings the Anunnaki to our solar system every 3,600 years? That massive celestial body whose existence is central to Sitchin's entire chronology and narrative structure. What do the actual Mesopotamian astronomical texts say about Nibiru? The word Nibiru does appear in Mesopotamian texts. Sitchin didn't simply invent it. But what it means in those texts is completely different from what Sitchin claims it means. Nibiru is an Akkadian word, not originally Sumerian, that translates roughly as crossing point, place of crossing, or ferry point, from a root meaning to cross or to traverse. It's used in various contexts in Akkadian literature, often quite mundane contexts having nothing to do with astronomy or planets. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, Nibiru appears in the phrase describing the crossing point, where a river can be forded, where a boatman might ferry people across. It's a geographical term, a place where crossing is possible. The word also appears in administrative texts referring to ferry fees, the price paid to cross a river at a Nibiru. In astronomical contexts, which is where Sitchin focuses, the word takes on more specialized meanings but still nothing like what Sitchin claims. In Babylonian astronomical texts, particularly in the astronomical compendium called Mul.Apin, Nibiru, is mentioned at different astronomical locations in conjunction with the positions of stars and planets, usually as the Star of Marduk, a celestial body or point associated with the god Marduk. The problem for anyone trying to understand what Nibiru meant astronomically to the Babylonians is that the various stars and planets mentioned in these texts were not subject to any fixed interpretation. The same divine name might refer to different celestial bodies at different times or in different contexts. For example, the Star of Ea is described at various points as Vela, Fomalhaut, and Venus, completely different celestial objects. Similarly, Nibiru is identified in different texts as Jupiter, occasionally as Mercury, sometimes as a constellation in the region of Libra, sometimes as a point on the celestial equator where certain astronomical phenomena occur, particularly around the autumnal equinox. The word appears to mean something like crossing point in the heavens, a place where celestial paths cross, possibly the point where the ecliptic crosses the celestial equator. What Nibiru is never identified as, in any ancient text, in any astronomical observation, in any Babylonian or Assyrian or Sumerian document, is a planet beyond Pluto, a massive celestial body in a 600-year elliptical orbit, a homeworld of extraterrestrials. That interpretation is entirely Sitchin's creation, unsupported by any textual evidence. The scholarly consensus, based on exhaustive analysis of all relevant texts by experts in Babylonian astronomy like Herman Hunger and David Brown, is that Nibiru referred to Jupiter in most astronomical contexts, occasionally to Mercury, and sometimes to specific astronomical positions or crossing points in the heavens. The confusion arises because Babylonian astronomical terminology was complex and context-dependent, not because there was a secret planet that mainstream astronomy has somehow missed. Modern astronomers, approaching this from a completely different direction than ancient text scholars, have pointed out repeatedly that Sitchin's proposed orbit for Nibiru is physically impossible given what we know about celestial mechanics and our solar system's stability. A planet with such an extremely elliptical orbit, passing through the inner solar system every 3,600 years, approaching close enough to Earth to affect our planet, would cause such massive gravitational disruptions that the consequences would be obvious and catastrophic. The orbits of all known planets would be noticeably perturbed, showing irregular variations that astronomers would have detected centuries ago. Earth's orbit wouldn't be the stable, nearly circular path that it is. We might not even still have our moon, which could have been torn away by gravitational stress. The outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, would show clear evidence of repeated gravitational disturbance every 3,600 years. Their orbits would have anomalies, perturbations, irregularities that don't exist in reality. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter would be disrupted, with asteroid orbits showing patterns of recent gravitational interference. Comets from the outer solar system would be deflected in ways that would point to a massive perturbing body. None of this is observed. Our solar system is remarkably stable, with planetary orbits that can be calculated precisely going back thousands of years and forward thousands of years. Stability that would be impossible if a massive planet were crashing through the inner system regularly. NASA has repeatedly, almost wearily, stated that there is no evidence for the existence of Planet X or Nibiru as Sitchin described it. If such a planet existed and was approaching Earth on its supposed 600-year cycle, we would have detected it decades ago with our increasingly powerful telescopes and detection methods. It would be visible to professional astronomers by now. It would show up in infrared surveys that can detect very dim, distant objects. Amateur astronomers with backyard telescopes worth a few $1,000s would be photographing it, posting images online discussing its position and trajectory. Astrophotography is a popular hobby with millions of practitioners worldwide. You can't hide a planet in the modern age of distributed astronomical observation. The claim that the Sumerians knew of 12 planets in the solar system, which Sitchin uses as evidence that they must have had extraterrestrial instruction, because ancient people couldn't possibly discover planets beyond Saturn with the naked eye, is simply false. Sumerian astronomical texts clearly show that they knew of 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These are the planets that any ancient civilization with patient observation could discover without telescopes. The Sumerians were excellent astronomers, keeping careful records over centuries, and they could see these 5 planets moving against the background of fixed stars, distinguishing them as wanderers, which is what the word planet means in Greek. They also tracked the sun and moon, which they considered celestial bodies of equal importance to the planets, not categorically different. In ancient astronomical thinking, anything that moved against the background of fixed stars was a wanderer, a traveller through the heavens, whether we would call it a planet or a star or a moon today. So they knew of 7 celestial wanderers, 5 planets plus sun and moon, not 12, never 12. The idea that they knew of Uranus, Neptune, Pluto and Nibiru, bringing the total to 12, has no basis in any text. It's Sitchin's fabrication, necessary for his theory but unsupported by evidence. Sitchin made much of a particular cylinder seal, one that has become famous or infamous in ancient astronaut circles. A small clay cylinder known to archaeologists as VA-243, housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. This seal dates to around 2500 BCE and shows a seated figure, presumably a deity or an important person, with other smaller figures approaching, presumably worshippers or supplicants. Above this scene is a cluster of dots and circular symbols, and one larger symbol that Sitchin identified as representing the Sun, surrounded by what he claimed were 11 planets, which with the Sun makes 12 bodies, his supposed evidence that the Sumerians knew the complete solar system plus Nibiru. Actual scholars of Mesopotamian iconography, experts who have studied thousands of cylinder seals and understand the conventions of Sumerian and Akkadian art, have thoroughly debunked this interpretation. The large symbol that Sitchin identified as the Sun doesn't match any of the hundreds of documented Sumerian and Akkadian symbols for the Sun that appear on other seals, in other artworks, in texts where solar symbols are clearly labelled. The Mesopotamians had standard ways of depicting the Sun, consistent iconographic conventions, and this symbol doesn't follow them. It's just a star, one of many stars, depicted using standard Mesopotamian artistic conventions for stars. The dots around it are also stars, not planets. This is clear from comparison with thousands of other Mesopotamian seals and artworks, where stars are regularly depicted in clusters, groups, arrangements that have nothing to do with astronomical accuracy and everything to do with artistic composition and symbolic meaning. The seal is about something else entirely, about human social hierarchy, or divine authority or religious devotion. When the text on seal VA-243 itself was actually translated by real scholars who can read Sumerian, it says, "You're his servant," a fairly standard message on administrative seals indicating the relationship between the person using the seal and their superior, is about bureaucracy and social relationships, not astronomy. Sitchin's mistranslations and misinterpretations weren't limited to a few isolated examples or innocent errors that anyone might make when working with difficult ancient texts. Scholar after scholar who has reviewed his work in detail has found systematic, pervasive problems with his interpretation of Sumerian and Akkadian sources, problems so extensive and consistent that they call into question whether Sitchin could actually read these languages as he claimed, or whether he was simply finding what he wanted to find, regardless of what the texts actually said. He quotes texts out of context, taking sentences or phrases and removing them from the surrounding material that would clarify their meaning. He truncates quotations, cutting them off at points that change their meaning, leaving out the parts that would contradict his interpretation. He assigns meanings to Sumerian and Akkadian words that don't align with any cuneiform dictionary, any lexical list, any scholarly consensus about what these words mean. The Mesopotamians themselves created bilingual dictionaries, Sumerian Akkadian lexical lists that tell us what Sumerian words meant to Akkadian speakers who used both languages, ancient dictionaries that scholars use to verify meanings and translations. Sitchin ignores these. He creates his own meanings based on what would support his theory, treating ancient languages as if they're codes to be cracked rather than languages to be understood through careful linguistic analysis. He ignores evidence that contradicts his theories, simply not mentioning texts or archaeological findings that would undermine his claims. When confronted with contrary evidence, his books don't engage with it or explain why it might be wrong or reconcile it with his theories. The evidence that supports his ideas gets extensive discussion. The evidence that contradicts his ideas doesn't exist in his books, creating a false impression that all evidence points in one direction when in reality, the vast majority of evidence points elsewhere. Dr. Ronald Fritzer, author of Invented Knowledge, False History, Fake Science and Pseudo-Religions, examined Sitchin's methodology in comprehensive detail, and his assessment is damning. He found that Sitchin's assignment of meanings to ancient words was tendentious and frequently strained, which in academic language is a polite way of saying deliberately biased and forced to fit predetermined conclusions. Fritzer wrote that when critics have checked Sitchin's references, they consistently find that he frequently quotes out of context or truncates his quotes in a way that distorts evidence in order to prove his contentions. Evidence is presented selectively, and contradictory evidence is ignored. This isn't the methodology of legitimate scholarship. This is the methodology of someone constructing a case regardless of truth. The academic consensus is unambiguous, clear, and based on extensive examination of both the ancient texts and Sitchin's claims about them. Sitchin's theory about the Anunnaki as ancient astronauts is pseudo-archaeology, pseudo-science, and pseudo-history. It's not that scholars are close-minded, that they're refusing to consider revolutionary ideas, that they're protecting their turf or suppressing inconvenient truths. It's that the evidence simply doesn't support Sitchin's claims in any way. The texts don't say what he claimed they said. The astronomy doesn't work. The linguistics are wrong. The archaeology contradicts his timeline. The physics makes his proposed planetary orbit impossible. Every discipline that touches on his claims, from Assyriology to astronomy, from linguistics to physics, finds his work fundamentally flawed. Yet the theory persists, arguably more popular than ever in some circles, spread through books and documentaries and social media, believed by millions of people worldwide despite overwhelming scholarly rejection, despite the complete absence of supporting evidence, despite the presence of massive contradicting evidence. Why? What makes Sitchin's story about ancient aliens so compelling that millions of people believe it, despite everything archaeology, astronomy, linguistics, and rational analysis can say against it? Why does ancient astronaut theory, in its various forms, persist and even thrive in an age of unprecedented scientific knowledge and easy access to information? Part of the answer lies in the nature of ancient texts themselves. They're fragmentary, mysterious, foreign to our modern experience, written in dead languages about cultures that vanished thousands of years ago, describing worldviews utterly different from our own. There's inherent romance in that, an appeal to the imagination that can't be denied. Ancient mysteries are exciting precisely because they're mysterious, because we can't ask the people who created these texts what they meant, because so much has been lost to time. When someone claims to have cracked the code, to have discovered what the ancient texts really mean, to have found the truth that everyone else missed, is thrilling. It feels like forbidden knowledge, like truth hidden from the masses, like being in on a secret that the establishment doesn't want you to know. Sitchin's theory also appeals to a kind of technological optimism or technological determinism. It suggests that humanity's greatest achievements The things we're most proud of as a species weren't really ours at all. We needed help. We needed instruction from advanced beings to create civilization. There's something oddly comforting about that for some people, the idea that we're not alone in the universe, that someone more powerful and knowledgeable has taken an interest in us, that our existence isn't random or accidental but a part of a larger cosmic plan. Even if that plan originally involved using us as miners and slaves, at least it's a plan. At least there's purpose and meaning rather than blind evolutionary chance. The ancient astronaut hypothesis also plays expertly into a particular kind of distrust of mainstream authority and expertise. If scholars and scientists are wrong about the Anunnaki, catastrophically wrong, if they've been misinterpreting these texts for over a century, if they can't see what's obvious to anyone who reads Sitchin's books, then what else might they be wrong about? What other truths might mainstream academia be hiding or missing or deliberately suppressing? This creates a sense of special knowledge, of possessing information that the credentialed experts don't have or won't acknowledge, of being smarter than the PhDs who spent decades studying these languages and cultures. It's the appeal of conspiracy thinking generally, the idea that you've seen through the lies and discovered the real truth. There's also what some critics have called the problem of archaeological racism embedded in ancient astronaut theories, though often unintentionally, perhaps unconsciously. The idea that ancient peoples, particularly non-European ancient peoples, couldn't have built impressive structures or developed sophisticated knowledge without alien help diminishes their achievements and capabilities in ways that are troubling when you think about the implications. The Sumerians were brilliant engineers, mathematicians, astronomers, and architects. They developed sophisticated irrigation technology through trial and error. They invented writing through gradual innovation. They built ziggurats through careful planning and massive organized labor. Suggesting they needed extraterrestrial instruction to accomplish any of this insults their intelligence and capability. The same pattern repeats for other civilizations beloved by ancient astronaut theorists. Ancient Egyptians couldn't possibly have built the pyramids without aliens, the theory goes, despite the fact that we understand quite well how they built them, despite the quarries and ramps and tool marks and administrative texts describing pyramid construction. The Inca couldn't have built Machu Picchu without extraterrestrial help, despite their demonstrated sophisticated stoneworking techniques and engineering knowledge. The mysterious megalithic builders of Malta and Göbekli Tepe must have had alien assistance, as if ancient humans weren't capable of moving large stones or carving them into shapes. It's a persistent diminishment of human achievement, a refusal to credit ancient peoples with the ingenuity and capability that they clearly possessed. But perhaps the deepest appeal of Sitchin's theory, the most powerful hook that keeps people believing despite all evidence to the contrary, is that it offers emotionally satisfying answers to questions that have troubled humanity for millennia, the big existential questions that keep us awake at night. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone in the universe? What is our purpose? Is there meaning to our existence? Mainstream science and history often can't provide emotionally fulfilling answers to these questions, not because the answers don't exist, but because the real answers are complex, uncertain, not neatly packaged into narratives that give us comfort and purpose. We evolved through natural selection from earlier hominids over millions of years is scientifically accurate, supported by massive amounts of genetic, fossil, and archaeological evidence, but it feels cold and purposeless to many people. There's no intention, no plan, no meaning beyond survival and reproduction. We were created by advanced aliens to mine gold is scientifically wrong, contradicted by all available evidence, but it offers a sense of purpose and cosmic connection, a reason for our existence beyond random chance. We're not accidents, we're designed. We're part of a larger story. Even if that story begins with exploitation, at least it's a story where we matter to someone. The problem, the fundamental issue that makes this so difficult to combat, is that emotionally satisfying answers aren't always true answers. The universe doesn't owe us emotionally fulfilling explanations for our existence. Reality is what it is, regardless of what we'd like it to be, regardless of what would make us feel better or give us more sense of purpose, or make the cosmos seem less empty and indifferent. Truth and comfort don't always align. Sometimes the truth is uncomfortable, unsatisfying, cold, and we have to live with that discomfort rather than retreating into comforting fictions. So if Sitchin's theory is wrong, comprehensively wrong, wrong in its linguistics and astronomy and archaeology and logic, what do the Sumerian texts actually tell us about the Anunnaki? What do they reveal about ancient Mesopotamian beliefs regarding creation, the divine, and the relationship between gods and humans? What can we learn from these texts when we read them as what they are, mythology and theology and literature, rather than trying to force them into a framework of ancient history and extraterrestrial contact? The answer is that we learn a great deal, far more interesting and valuable than any ancient astronaut theory could provide. The Sumerians and their Mesopotamian successors had a complex, sophisticated theology that evolved and changed over more than 3,000 years of continuous cultural development. Their gods weren't merely powerful beings with advanced technology masquerading as deities. They were personifications of natural forces, embodiments of cosmic principles, expressions of the anxieties and hopes of an agricultural civilization living in a harsh, unpredictable environment where survival depended on understanding and working with forces beyond human control. Anu represented the heavens, not as a planet or location but as the vast sky that dominated their world. The dome of heaven that arched over everything, containing the stars and weather and celestial phenomena. Enlil was the storm, embodying the unpredictable, powerful, sometimes destructive force that could bring life-giving rain for crops or devastating floods and winds that destroyed them. Enki was the life-giving water, specifically the sweet underground water, the springs and rivers and underground reservoirs that made civilization possible in what would otherwise be desert, and also the wisdom and intelligence required to manage that water properly, to build irrigation systems, to distribute water fairly, to maintain the infrastructure that sustained life. Inanna, later Ishtar, was the complex mix of love and violence, creation and destruction that characterized both sexual relationships and warfare, that drove both procreation and conquest. These weren't just metaphors for the ancient Mesopotamians. They genuinely believed their gods existed as conscious beings with personalities and desires and emotions, beings who could be appeased through sacrifice and ritual, who could be angered by human behavior or pleased by proper worship, who had their own politics and conflicts and romances that played out in mythological narratives. The temples weren't just cultural centers or civic buildings or places where people gathered. They were literal houses where the gods dwelt, where divine beings resided in physical form through their cult statues. Temple priests followed elaborate daily rituals of feeding these statues, placing actual food before them, clothing them in expensive garments, entertaining them with music and dance, all based on the genuine belief that gods, like humans, had physical and emotional needs requiring attention. The relationship between humans and gods was understood as reciprocal but hierarchical. Humans provided worship, sacrifices, maintenance of temples, and most importantly the agricultural labor that produced food for offerings. Gods provided cosmic order, protection from chaos, the fundamental conditions that made civilized life possible, victory in war, and agricultural fertility. The Anunnaki, in this rich, theological context, were part of the divine hierarchy, but not the whole of it, not even the most important part necessarily. They were powerful gods, certainly, descendants of the sky god Anu, which gave them high status, but their roles and significance shifted over time between different cities and different periods. Sometimes they were judges of the dead, sitting in the underworld determining the fates of souls. Sometimes they were heavenly administrators, the 300 or 600 gods assigned to maintain order in different parts of the cosmos. Sometimes they were simply a collective term for major gods, as opposed to minor spirits and demons and local deities. Their function was governance, judgment, administration, maintaining the cosmic order that Marduk or other crater gods had established. The creation of humanity in Mesopotamian myth, when read as theology rather than mistranslated science, served multiple purposes in their worldview. It explained the human condition in terms that made sense within their cultural framework. Why do we have to work so hard, especially at agriculture? Because we were created specifically to do that work, to maintain the fields and irrigation systems that sustain civilization. Our existence has purpose, even if that purpose is labor. Why do we suffer? Because the gods sometimes conflict with each other, and humans inevitably get caught in between divine politics and cosmic struggles. Our suffering isn't random or meaningless. It's collateral damage from forces beyond our control, but not beyond understanding. Why do we die while gods live forever? Because immortality belongs only to the divine. Because we're made of clay that returns to dust even though we have divine breath that gives us consciousness. Death is the boundary between mortal and immortal existence, a fundamental law of the cosmos. The Atrahasis epic, when read as mythology rather than mistranslated alien contact narrative, is actually quite sophisticated in its theological and philosophical implications. It presents a cosmos where even gods face constraints and conflicts, where not all divine beings agree on the right course of action, where creation emerges from necessity rather than pure will. The rebellion of the Igigi is fundamentally about labor and justice, even at the divine level. Even divine beings can be oppressed, can be pushed beyond endurance, can reach a breaking point where they demand better conditions. The creation of humanity is presented as a compromise, a solution that benefits gods but that also has unintended consequences. Humans prove to be too successful at their assigned task, too numerous, too productive of civilization, too disruptive to divine peace. The flood story in the Atrahasis isn't primarily about punishment for sin, as it becomes in the biblical version centuries later. It's about noise, about overpopulation, about the unintended consequences of successful creation. Humans are literally too loud, and Enlil, the storm god who values order and quiet, can't sleep. The solution he proposes, divine genocide through flooding, is portrayed in the text as extreme, perhaps even unjust. The text explicitly calls Enlil's decision an evil deed against mankind, a remarkable moral judgment for an ancient religious text to make about the actions of a major deity. This suggests that the Mesopotamians could think critically about divine authority, could question whether the gods always acted rightly, could see ethical problems even in cosmic decisions. Enki's intervention to save humanity isn't rebellion against legitimate divine authority, but a different moral calculation, a recognition that destroying one's own creation would be wasteful and wrong, that humans, despite their flaws, have value and deserve to continue existing. When the flood ends and the gods discover that humans survived through Enki's warning to Atrahasis, their reaction is telling. Enlil is furious, yes, but the other gods aren't. They're relieved. They were starving without human offerings and sacrifices. They need humans as much as humans need them. This is a worldview where gods and humans exist in a state of mutual dependence, where the relationship is transactional but not cold, where there's room for divine mercy and divine regret and divine affection toward humanity. The Enuma Elish offers a different creation narrative, one focused more on cosmic order emerging from primordial chaos, on younger gods overthrowing older powers, on creation through violence and conquest rather than through labor needs. The primordial beings Apsu and Tiamat represent fresh water and salt water, the fundamental elements from which everything else emerges in Mesopotamian cosmology. Their offspring, the younger gods, are loud and disruptive and disturbing, breaking the primordial peace that existed before consciousness and activity. Apsu wants to destroy them to restore quiet, but Ea, god of wisdom, kills Apsu first in self-defense. Tiamat, enraged by her consort's death and urged on by some of the gods who supported Apsu, creates an army of monsters and prepares for cosmic war against the younger generation of deities. The young gods are terrified and unwilling to face this primordial chaos monster, until Marduk, Ea's son, young and ambitious and powerful, agrees to fight Tiamat on one condition. If he wins, he must be made king of all the gods, supreme ruler of the cosmos. The other gods, desperate for a champion, agree to this deal. Marduk defeats Tiamat using winds and storms and nets, captures her, splits her body in half like a shellfish, and from her corpse creates the organized cosmos, heaven and earth, the structured universe we inhabit. This is political theology, mythology serving state ideology. The Enuma Elish was written in Babylon during its rise to power, probably during or after the reign of Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, when Babylon was displacing older Sumerian cities and establishing dominance over Mesopotamia. Marduk was Babylon's patron god, originally a relatively minor agricultural deity but elevated to cosmic significance as Babylon's political power grew. By making him the creator of the world and king of the gods, the Enuma Elish justified Babylon's political dominance theologically. If Marduk is the supreme deity who created the cosmos and defeated chaos, then Babylon, his city, should naturally be the supreme power politically. The text works as both cosmology and propaganda, explaining how the universe came to be while also explaining why Babylon deserved to rule. The creation of humanity in the Enuma Elish is almost an afterthought, mentioned briefly at the end. Marduk creates humans from the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's defeated general and consort, to serve the gods so that divine beings can rest from labor. It's similar in purpose to the Atrahasis, but different in detail and emphasis. What both texts share, what most Mesopotamian creation narratives share, is the idea that humanity has a purpose in the cosmic order. We're not accidents or evolutionary flukes or random developments. We have a role to play, work to do, relationships to maintain with the divine powers that govern the cosmos. From a modern perspective, from our viewpoint of individual autonomy and human rights and democratic equality, the idea that we exist to serve gods might seem degrading, might feel like enslavement or exploitation. But for ancient Mesopotamians living in a world where most people did serve someone, where social hierarchies were assumed to be natural and necessary, where everyone from slaves to kings understood themselves as having obligations to those above them, this theological framework provided meaning and structure to existence. You weren't laboring in fields just for survival or profit. You were maintaining cosmic order, feeding the gods, sustaining civilization, playing your part in the great system that kept chaos at bay. The Mesopotamian worldview also included sophisticated cosmology and astronomical knowledge that developed over millennia of careful observation and mathematical analysis. The Sumerians and their successors carefully observed the sky, tracked the movements of planets and stars with remarkable precision, predicted eclipses using mathematical models, developed calendars that reconciled the solar year with the lunar month, all without any need for extraterrestrial instruction. They didn't need aliens to teach them astronomy. They needed time, patience, careful record-keeping that writing made possible, mathematical thinking that they developed independently, and the motivation that came from believing that celestial phenomena had divine significance and terrestrial importance. The ziggurat temples that dominated Mesopotamian cities weren't landing pads for spacecraft, as ancient astronaut theorists sometimes claim. They were artificial mountains, architectural representations of the cosmic mountain where heaven and earth met in mythological geography. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the gods dwelt on a great mountain, and ziggurats were humanity's attempt to create that sacred space in the flat Mesopotamian plain to build a meeting place between human and divine realms. Priests climbed to the tops of ziggurats to perform rituals, to get closer to the gods, to mediate between earthly and heavenly spheres. The architecture had religious and cosmological meaning, not practical aerospace engineering purposes. The cuneiform writing system that preserved all this mythology and knowledge wasn't a gift from extraterrestrials. We can trace its evolution in archaeological record from simple pictographs representing physical objects, a jar of grain, a head of cattle, a star in the sky, to increasingly abstract symbols representing sounds and concepts, ideas that had no simple visual representation. This evolution took centuries, happening gradually as scribes experimented with ways to capture more complex information, to record not just quantities but names and relationships and actions. Early texts from around 3400 BCE are purely administrative, tallies and records. By 3000 BCE, texts are recording names and titles. By 2500 BCE, full grammatical Sumerian sentences. By 2000 BCE, complex literature, mythology, legal codes, scientific observations. This is developmental progress we can track in the archaeological record, innovation building on innovation, not sudden wholesale transfer of alien knowledge. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge preserved in Mesopotamian tablets, impressive as it is, wasn't impossibly advanced for ancient people. It was exactly the level of knowledge you'd expect from a civilization that had been carefully observing the sky and recording data for thousands of years, that had developed sophisticated mathematics for practical purposes like land surveying and tax calculation and construction, that had the motivation and resources to support a class of professional scribes and scholars who could dedicate their lives to study. Yes, they knew the exact length of the lunar month to within seconds of modern measurements. Yes, they could predict eclipses decades in advance. Yes, they understood mathematical concepts like the Pythagorean theorem over 1,000 years before Pythagoras. But they figured these things out through observation and calculation and testing and refinement over centuries, not alien instruction. The irrigation systems that allowed Sumerian civilization to flourish in a desert environment were products of engineering trial and error over generations, not extraterrestrial technology. Early attempts at irrigation probably failed catastrophically. Canals silted up when builders didn't account for sediment accumulation. Canal walls collapsed when not built strong enough. Water flooded where it wasn't wanted and dried up where it was needed most. But over generations, through accumulating experience and transmitted knowledge and incremental improvements, Mesopotamian engineers learned how to manage water, how to build durable canals that could last for years or decades, how to calculate proper gradients so water would flow but not too fast, how to distribute irrigation fairly among different fields and farmers, how to maintain systems over time. This is human learning, human innovation, human problem solving, impressive precisely because it was accomplished without modern tools or scientific theory, not because it required alien intervention. The same applies to Mesopotamian architecture and monumental construction. Yes, they built massive ziggurats, some over 300 feet tall, architectural marvels that dominated the landscape for miles around. Yes, they built city walls that stretched for miles, thick enough to resist siege warfare. Yes, they built palace complexes and temple compounds that covered acres and contained hundreds of rooms. But we understand how they did it. We have texts describing construction projects, mathematical calculations for brick production, management documents organizing labor forces. We have archaeological evidence of the ramps and scaffolding they used, the tools they worked with, the techniques they employed. There's no mystery that requires an alien explanation, just human organization, mathematical knowledge, engineering skill, and massive amounts of labor carefully coordinated over years or decades. What made Sumerian civilization and its successors remarkable wasn't alien intervention. It was human ingenuity applied consistently over millennia. People looked at a harsh environment, a desert plain between two rivers prone to flooding and drought, and figured out not just how to survive, but how to thrive. They developed technologies, social organizations, religious systems, cultural practices that allowed them to create one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world, possibly the most sophisticated for its time period. They invented writing and used it to preserve and transmit knowledge across generations. They developed mathematics and used it to manage complex societies and understand natural phenomena. They created literature and used it to explore fundamental questions about human existence and divine nature. They built cities and organized urban life at scales previously unknown. They established legal codes that applied equally to all citizens, moving toward justice through law rather than personal power. Diminishing these achievements by attributing them to extraterrestrials does the ancient Mesopotamians a profound disservice and misses what's actually impressive about human history. The Sumerians were smart, creative, hard-working people who built something extraordinary through their own efforts, their own intelligence, their own accumulated knowledge and transmitted wisdom. That's more impressive than any alien intervention story could ever be. It's more inspiring to know that humans created civilization without outside help, that we figured things out ourselves, that we're capable of remarkable achievements through cooperation and innovation and persistent effort over generations, ancient astronaut theories actually sell humanity short, suggesting we're not capable of greatness without extraterrestrial instruction, that our ancestors couldn't have accomplished what they clearly did accomplish. The same pattern holds for other ancient civilizations that ancient astronaut theorists love to cite as examples of alien intervention. The Egyptians didn't need aliens to build pyramids. They needed sophisticated mathematical knowledge, which they developed. They needed organizational capability to coordinate thousands of workers, which they demonstrated repeatedly. They needed decades of construction time, which they had. They needed the motivation that came from religious belief in divine kingship and afterlife, which their culture provided. We understand pyramid construction quite well from quarries still showing tool marks, from ramps and construction debris, from administrative texts describing worker organization and ration distribution, from experimental archaeology where modern researchers build pyramids using ancient techniques. No aliens required, just human capability and determination. The Inca didn't need extraterrestrial help to build Machu Picchu or to work stone so precisely that blades can't fit between blocks. They needed sophisticated stoneworking techniques, which they developed over centuries. They needed understanding of how to shape and fit irregular stones, which they mastered through experience. They needed organizational systems to move massive stones through mountainous terrain, which their Quipu record-keeping and meter labor system provided. They needed the engineering knowledge to build on steep slopes without structures collapsing, which they acquired through accumulated experience. Modern scholars who have studied Inca construction methods understand how they accomplished these feats. It's impressive human engineering, not alien technology. The builders of megalithic sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey or Karnak in France or Malta's temples didn't need ancient astronaut assistance. They needed time, lots of it, and motivation, usually religious and organization, the ability to coordinate labor and engineering knowledge that developed through trial and error, and techniques for moving and shaping large stones that humans have demonstrated capability for throughout history. Mystery isn't the same as impossibility. Just because we don't have complete documentation of exactly how ancient peoples accomplished something doesn't mean they couldn't have accomplished it. Doesn't mean aliens must have done it. The gaps in our knowledge reflect the fragmentary nature of archaeological evidence, not the intervention of extraterrestrials. So why, given all this evidence, all these expert rebuttals, all this archaeological and linguistic and astronomical correction, does the ancient astronaut theory persist? Why do millions of people still believe that the Anunnaki were literal aliens who created humanity, despite everything that scholarship can say against it? We've touched on some reasons already: the appeal of mystery and forbidden knowledge, the comfort of cosmic purpose, the distrust of mainstream authority. But there are additional factors worth considering. Part of the problem is simply that Sitchin's books are more accessible and exciting than academic archaeology texts. They tell a coherent story with drama and conflict and cosmic significance. They are written for general audiences without technical jargon or scholarly caution. Academic texts, with their careful qualifications, their probably and might and the evidence suggests, their acknowledgement of uncertainty and alternative interpretations, can't compete with Sitchin's confident assertions and dramatic narratives. The 12th Planet reads like thrilling non-fiction adventure. Academic papers on Mesopotamian religion read like, well, academic papers, dense and careful and hedged with appropriate scholarly uncertainty. There's also a massive problem of correction and education, of getting accurate information to people who have absorbed Sitchin's theories. His books are widely available in bookstores, libraries, online retailers, translated into dozens of languages. Academic rebuttals, Dr. Heiser's detailed linguistic analyses, Dr. Fritz's methodological critiques, papers by Assyriologists explaining what texts actually say. These are buried in scholarly journals behind paywalls, on academic websites that general audiences never visit, in technical language that non-specialists find difficult to parse. The misinformation is easily accessible and compellingly presented. the correction is difficult to access and often presented in ways that don't engage general audiences. Popular culture has amplified Sitchin's ideas far beyond what his books alone could achieve. The Ancient Aliens television series, which premiered in 2009 and has run for over 20 seasons on the History Channel and internationally, presents ancient astronaut theories as plausible alternative history worth a serious consideration. The show brings in various experts, some with legitimate credentials in unrelated fields, some with questionable or fabricated credentials, to discuss ancient mysteries and suggest extraterrestrial explanations. Millions of viewers watch these shows, many without the background to critically evaluate the claims being made, without awareness of how thoroughly these theories have been debunked by actual experts in relevant fields. The show's format, dramatic music and editing suggesting profound mysteries and cover-ups, lends illegitimate credibility to pseudoscientific theories. Video games incorporate ancient astronaut themes, making them part of entertainment that millions of young people engage with. Science fiction novels and movies use Anunnaki and Nibiru and ancient alien scenarios, further embedding these ideas in popular consciousness even as fiction. The more often people encounter these concepts, the more familiar they become, and familiarity often breeds acceptance. Social media has created echo chambers where believers can find confirmation for their views without encountering serious scholarly criticism, without their assumptions being challenged by contrary evidence. Algorithms show people more of what they already believe, more content that confirms their existing views, creating feedback loops where false narratives get reinforced through repetition rather than evidence. There's also a generational issue that's significant. Many people were first introduced to these ideas when they were young, teenagers or young adults reading Sitchin's books or watching documentaries based on his theories. These early impressions, formed during intellectually formative years, are remarkably hard to shake even when confronted with contrary evidence later. Belief becomes part of identity, woven into how people understand the world and their place in it. Admitting you were wrong, that you believed something false for years or decades, feels like losing part of yourself, like acknowledging you were fooled or gullible. The psychological barriers to changing fundamental beliefs are substantial, even when evidence clearly demands it. Perhaps most importantly, many people genuinely want the ancient astronaut theory to be true. They want to believe we're not alone in the universe, that advanced civilizations exist beyond Earth, that contact has occurred or will occur. They want to believe that ancient mysteries have exciting, paradigm-shifting explanations that overturn conventional understanding. They want to believe that there's more to reality than what mainstream science tells us, that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than the materialist narrative allows. These desires are understandable, even beautiful in their way. The universe is vast and strange, full of phenomena we don't fully understand. The idea that we might have been visited by advanced beings, that we might be part of a larger cosmic community, is genuinely compelling and emotionally satisfying. The problem, the fundamental issue that makes this so challenging, is that wanting something to be true doesn't make it true. Believing something with great passion and conviction doesn't create evidence for it. The universe operates according to physical laws regardless of our desires or beliefs. Ancient texts say what they say regardless of what we wish they said. Archaeological evidence reveals what it reveals regardless of what explanations would be more exciting. Truth doesn't care about our preferences. Reality is what it is, indifferent to whether we find it satisfying or disappointing, comforting or disturbing. The real story of the Anunnaki, the actual content of Sumerian and Akkadian texts when read honestly and carefully by people who actually understand these ancient languages and cultural contexts, is fascinating enough without the overlay of alien intervention. These texts show us how an ancient civilization understood their world, their place in it, their relationship with forces beyond their control. They show us the development of religious and philosophical thought over thousands of years, the evolution of complex theological ideas, the ways humans have always asked questions about meaning and purpose and origin, and tried to answer those questions through story and myth and ritual. The Sumerians created a mythology that explained their existence, that gave structure to their society, that helped them make sense of a world that was often harsh and unpredictable and dangerous. Their gods weren't aliens, but personifications of natural forces and social institutions, beings that embodied both the terror and wonder of existence in ancient Mesopotamia. They represented the sky that might bring rain or drought, the storms that might nourish or destroy, the water that sustained life, the fertility that allowed reproduction, the war that determined survival, the death that came to all living things. These were the forces that governed their lives, and giving these forces personality and consciousness, making them into gods who could be approached and appealed to and influenced through proper ritual, gave ancient people a sense of agency in dealing with powers beyond their direct control. The Anunnaki were part of that system, divine administrators in a cosmos that the Sumerians imagined as organized like their own city-states, with hierarchies of authority, distributions of responsibility, complex relationships between different levels of power. It's anthropomorphization, humans projecting their own social structures onto the divine realm. But it's also sophisticated theological thinking about how order emerges from chaos, how different forces in the universe relate to each other, how governance and judgment and maintenance of systems work at cosmic scale. The creation stories in Sumerian texts address the same questions that creation stories in every culture address. The fundamental existential questions that humans have always asked. Where did we come from? Why do we exist? What is our purpose? Why is life hard? Why do we suffer and die? What is our relationship to the forces that govern our existence? The Mesopotamian answer to these questions, expressed through texts like Atrahasis and Enuma Elish, and countless other myths and hymns and prayers, was that we were created to serve the gods, that our labor makes divine existence possible or at least more comfortable, that we're caught sometimes in conflicts between different divine powers pursuing different agendas, that death is simply the boundary between mortal and immortal existence. The fundamental distinction between human and divine is not the only possible answer to existential questions, and it's not the modern scientific answer based on evolution and cosmology, but it's a coherent worldview that made sense within its own cultural context, that provided meaning and purpose to people living in difficult circumstances, that helped them understand suffering and injustice and mortality in ways that made existence bearable. Modern people looking at these texts can appreciate them as windows into ancient thought, without needing to believe they're historically or scientifically accurate. We can understand the Epic of Gilgamesh as great literature exploring timeless themes of friendship, mortality, the limits of human power, the inevitability of death, without believing that Gilgamesh was literally two-thirds God, or that he actually went on a quest to find immortality. We can read the Enuma Elish as political theology serving Babylonian state ideology, while also being sophisticated cosmological thinking about order and chaos, without believing that the world was literally created from a slain goddess's body. We can appreciate Mesopotamian astronomy and mathematics as genuine achievements of human observation and calculation without needing to attribute them to alien instruction. Similarly, we can read the Atrahasis as sophisticated reflection on labor, creation, divine human relations, the unintended consequences of success, without needing to reinterpret it as garbled account of genetic engineering by extraterrestrials. The text works perfectly well as mythology, as theological and philosophical thinking expressed through narrative. It doesn't need to be history to be valuable or meaningful, or worth studying and preserving. What the ancient astronaut theorists have done, what Sitchin started and what countless followers have continued, is take texts that were working perfectly well as mythology and try to force them into a historical framework where they don't fit, where they make no sense, where violence has to be done to the actual words and meanings to make them say what the theory requires. It's like taking a novel and insisting it must be disguised autobiography, demanding to know the exact GPS coordinates where fictional events occurred. It's like taking a parable and refusing to accept its moral or philosophical meaning because you're too focused on whether the specific scenario literally happened. It misses the point of the genre, mistakes the purpose of the text, and ultimately learns less than you would if you approach the material on its own terms. The irony is that the real history of Mesopotamia, the actual development of Sumerian and Akkadian civilization over 3,000 years, with all its genuine innovations and achievements and complexities, is more interesting and more impressive than Sitchin's alien intervention story. The real evolution of Mesopotamian mythology, reflecting changing political circumstances and theological developments and cultural exchanges with neighboring civilizations, is more fascinating than a static story of ancient astronauts landing and leaving. The work of archaeologists and linguists who have painstakingly recovered this history, who have learned dead languages that no one had spoken for over 2,000 years, who have deciphered fragmentary texts and pieced together the story of the entire civilization from clay shards and ruined walls and buried tablets. That's the real adventure and the real discovery. It doesn't require conspiracy theories or pseudoscience or mistranslation. It requires patience, rigor, intellectual honesty, respect for evidence, willingness to admit uncertainty when evidence is unclear, and commitment to letting the texts speak for themselves rather than imposing predetermined conclusions onto them. So what forced the Anunnaki to come to Earth according to Sumerian texts? The honest, accurate answer based on what those texts actually say is, nothing forced them to come to Earth because the Anunnaki didn't come to Earth. They were already there in Sumerian mythology and theology, as gods who had always existed in the cosmos alongside humans, who had created humans for divine purposes, who governed the world and judged the dead and maintained cosmic order. They were part of the Mesopotamian pantheon, divine beings within the normal framework of ancient Near Eastern polytheism, not extraterrestrial visitors from another planet. The question itself, what forced the Anunnaki to come to Earth, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Anunnaki were and what the Sumerian texts actually say about them. It's a question that makes sense only within Sitchin's invented framework, not within actual Mesopotamian religion and mythology. If we ask instead what the Sumerian texts tell us about the Anunnaki, when we read those texts honestly and carefully, we get different and more interesting answers. We learn about a pantheon of gods with complex relationships and assigned roles in cosmic administration. We learn about divine politics, conflicts between different gods representing different natural forces or supporting different cities. We learn about how ancient Mesopotamians understood the structure of reality and their place within it, how they thought about the relationship between human and divine, how they made sense of suffering and injustice and death. If we ask what the Sumerian texts tell us about human origins in Mesopotamian belief, we learn that they believed we were created from clay mixed with divine blood to serve the gods, to do agricultural labor that maintained civilization, to provide worship and offerings that sustain the divine realm, and that our existence has purpose even if that purpose is defined by service rather than autonomy. If we ask what the Sumerian texts tell us about ancient Mesopotamian civilization more broadly, we learn about sophisticated culture with advanced technology for its time period, complex social organization, deep philosophical and theological thought, remarkable achievements in literature and mathematics and astronomy and engineering and law. We learn that the Sumerians and their successors were brilliant, creative, innovative people who accomplished extraordinary things through human intelligence and effort, who created the first civilization in human history and many of the institutions and technologies that all subsequent civilizations would build upon. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, urban planning, monumental architecture, legal codes, complex literature, organized religion, all of these begin in Mesopotamia, all developed by humans without extraterrestrial intervention or instruction. The story of how these texts were rediscovered in the 19th and 20th centuries, deciphered by brilliant scholars working with fragmentary evidence, translated through patient analysis and comparison, and studied to reconstruct entire civilization that had been lost for millennia. That real story of archaeological and linguistic achievement is itself fascinating and inspiring. It represents one of the great triumphs of modern scholarship, the recovery of entire civilizations from silence and oblivion, giving voice again to people who lived and died thousands of years ago. The tablets themselves are almost miraculous in their survival, baked clay hard enough to last for thousands of years, buried in ruins, protected by the very destruction that ended the civilizations that created them. When we can hold a tablet written 4,000 years ago, when we can read words written by an ancient scribe recording some transaction or copying out an old myth, we're touching the deep past in a way that's almost impossible with other materials that decay and vanish. These tablets don't need to be reinterpreted as historical accounts of alien contact to be valuable. They're valuable as what they are: the literary and cultural heritage of ancient Mesopotamia, the earliest examples of human writing, records of how our ancestors thought and believed and understood the world they inhabited. Respecting them means reading them on their own terms, in their own context, without imposing modern theories or desires onto texts that were created for entirely different purposes in entirely different cultural frameworks. It means acknowledging that the Sumerians were people like us, capable of sophisticated thought without needing alien teachers, creating meaning and beauty and knowledge through their own efforts and intelligence. The persistence of ancient astronaut theories, despite overwhelming evidence against them, is a reminder of how powerful storytelling can be, how much people crave exciting explanations for mysteries, how difficult it is to correct misinformation once it's become culturally embedded and personally meaningful. But it's also a reminder of why critical thinking matters, why we need to check sources and verify claims and not just believe things because they sound good, or because they're presented with confidence, or because they appear on television or in popular books. Sitchin sounded confident. He wrote with authority. He claimed to have cracked codes that professional scholars somehow missed. But confidence isn't the same as correctness, and authority in presentation isn't the same as accuracy in content. Credentials matter, training matters, methodology matters, evidence matters. The scholars who have debunked Sitchin's theories, who have patiently explained what Sumerian texts actually say, who have corrected his mistranslations and pointed out his methodological failures, they didn't do this because they're close-minded, or because they wanted to suppress revolutionary truth, or because they're protecting their academic territory. They did it because they actually read ancient languages correctly. They actually understand archaeological context and cultural frameworks. They actually know what the texts say when properly translated and interpreted. Their expertise is real and hard-earned, the result of years or decades of study and research. Their rigorous methodology, their careful qualifications, their acknowledgement of uncertainty, these aren't weaknesses but strengths, signs of intellectual honesty and commitment to truth over comfortable fictions. This doesn't mean we should blindly trust all experts, or accept everything academic consensus says without question. Scholarship involves debate and disagreement and revision of theories as new evidence emerges. Experts can be wrong, consensus can change, new discoveries can overturn previous understanding. But there's a crucial difference between legitimate scholarly disagreement within a field and fringe theories that contradict all available evidence and are rejected by virtually everyone with relevant expertise. The ancient astronaut theory isn't a minority position among scholars that deserves consideration alongside mainstream views. It's a pseudoscientific claim that ignores or misrepresents evidence, that makes assertions not supported by the texts it claims to interpret, that has been comprehensively debunked by experts in every relevant field from Assyriology to astronomy. For those who have believed in Sitchin's theories, who have found meaning or excitement in ancient astronaut narratives, confronting the reality that these theories are false can be genuinely difficult. It's hard to admit we've been wrong about something we believe strongly, something we maybe built part of our identity around, something we've argued for with friends or family. It's easier psychologically to dismiss critics as closed-minded, to believe in conspiracies of suppression, to retreat into echo chambers where everyone agrees with you, than to accept that exciting story you believed wasn't true after all. But intellectual growth and honest requires being willing to change our minds when evidence demands it, being able to say, I believed this, but I was wrong and now I know better. That's not weakness or failure. That's integrity. That's how we grow as thinkers and as people. Before we close, let me take a moment to thank you for staying with me through this lengthy, detailed exploration of the Anunnaki, ancient Mesopotamian texts, and the rise of ancient astronaut theories. I know it's easy and tempting to believe exciting theories, especially when they're presented with confidence and seem to explain so much and offer such satisfying answers to profound questions. But I hope this journey through actual evidence, through what scholars who read ancient languages actually find in Sumerian and Akkadian texts, through the archaeological and astronomical realities that contradict Sitchin's claims, has shown that reality, when honestly examined, is more interesting and more inspiring than comfortable fiction, no matter how appealing that fiction might be. If you found this exploration valuable, if you appreciate the effort to separate fact from fiction in ancient history, to examine evidence carefully and reach conclusions based on what texts actually say rather than what we wish they said, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes it possible for me to create more content like this. More deep dives into historical questions that deserve thoughtful, evidence-based, rigorous examination rather than sensationalist speculation. I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below this video. Were you familiar with Sitchin's theories before watching this? Has this changed your perspective on ancient astronaut claims in any way? What other historical mysteries would you like to see examined with this kind of detailed, evidence-focused analysis? What questions do you still have about Mesopotamian civilization or ancient texts? Remember, the goal here isn't to be cynical or to deny that genuine mysteries exist in ancient history and archaeology. Real mysteries do exist, questions we haven't answered yet, phenomena we don't fully understand, gaps in our knowledge where evidence is fragmentary or ambiguous. The goal is to approach those genuine mysteries with rigor and honesty, to let evidence speak for itself rather than imposing our desires and preconceptions onto it, to distinguish between what we know, what we don't know, and what we merely wish were true. The ancient world is genuinely full of wonders, remarkable achievements that don't require supernatural or extraterrestrial explanations, human accomplishments that are impressive precisely because they were human accomplishments achieved without modern technology or scientific knowledge. The Sumerians were our ancestors in civilization, if not necessarily in direct biological descent. They invented so much that we take for granted today, technologies and institutions and ways of organizing society and preserving knowledge that all subsequent civilizations have built upon and modified and transmitted forward through time. They deserve to be understood on their own terms, celebrated for their own genuine achievements, not used as props in modern myth-making about ancient aliens, not having their accomplishments attributed to extraterrestrial intervention that diminishes what they actually did. So the next time you hear someone claim that ancient texts reveal extraterrestrial contact, that mysterious monuments prove alien technology, that our ancestors couldn't have achieved what they clearly did achieve without outside help from advanced beings, remember the Sumerians. Remember what they actually accomplished with human intelligence and human effort. Remember what their texts actually say when read carefully and honestly by people who understand ancient languages and cultural contexts. Remember that humans are capable of remarkable things and always have been. We don't need ancient astronauts to explain our own achievements. The truth about the Anunnaki, when examined carefully and honestly, is that they reveal not alien intervention but human imagination, not genetic engineering but theological creativity, not historical fact but mythological meaning expressed through story and symbol. And that truth, properly understood in its full context and implications, is more profound and more genuinely inspiring than any ancient astronaut theory could ever be. It shows us that humans have always asked the big questions about existence and purpose and meaning, have always created sophisticated ways to think about those questions, have always built remarkable civilizations through cooperation and innovation, and accumulated knowledge transmitted across generations. The Anunnaki as ancient Mesopotamians understood them, as divine administrators maintaining cosmic order, as judges determining fates, as gods governing the relationship between human and divine realms. They tell us something important about how ancient people made sense of their world. how they thought about power and authority and justice, how they understood their own place in a cosmos full of forces beyond their control or comprehension. That's the real value of these texts, not as secret histories of alien contact, but as windows into ancient minds, ancient cultures, ancient ways of being human in a difficult and mysterious world. Thanks for watching this extended exploration, and I'll see you in the next one.